Chapter 10. On Tuesday night, most of what I thought I understood about myself had turned out to be wrong. On Sunday morning, my dad and I were supposed to pack our things and go home. I had just a few days to decide what to do. Stay or go. Neither option seemed good. How could I possibly stay here and leave behind everything I'd known? But after all I'd learned, how could I go home? Even worse, there was no one I could talk to about it. Dad was out of the question. Emma made frequent and passionate arguments as to why I should stay, none of which acknowledged the life I would be abandoning, however meager it seemed, or how the sudden inexplicable disappearance of their only child might affect my parents, or the stifling suffocation that Emma herself had admitted feeling inside the loop. She would only say, "With you here, it'll be better." Miss Peregrine was even less helpful. Her only answer was that she couldn't make such a decision for me, even though I only wanted to talk it through. Still, it was obvious she wanted me to stay. Beyond my own safety, my presence in the loop would make everyone else safer. But I didn't relish the idea of spending my life as their watchdog. I was beginning to suspect my grandfather had felt the same way, and it was part of the reason he'd refused to return after the war. Joining the Peculiar Children would also mean I wouldn't finish high school, or go to college, or do any of the normal growing up things people do. Then again, I had to keep reminding myself I wasn't normal, and as long as hollows were hunting me, any life lived outside the loop would almost certainly be cut short. I'd spend the rest of my days living in fear, looking over my shoulder, tormented by nightmares, waiting for them to finally come back and punch my ticket. That sounded a lot worse than missing out on college. Then I thought, isn't there a third option? Couldn't I be like Grandpa Portman, who for 50 years had lived and thrived and fended off hollows outside the loop? That's when the self-deprecating voice in my head kicked in. He was military trained, dummy. A stone-cold badass. He had a walk-in closet full of sawed-off shotguns. The man was Rambo compared to you. I could sign up for a class at the gun range, the optimistic part of me would think. Take karate? Work out? Are you joking? You couldn't even protect yourself in high school. You had to bribe that redneck to be your bodyguard, and you'd wet your pants if you so much as pointed a real gun at anyone. No, I wouldn't. You're weak. You're a loser. That's why he never told you who you really were. He knew you couldn't handle it. Shut up. Shut up. For days I went back and forth like this. Stay or go. I obsessed constantly without resolution. Meanwhile, Dad completely lost steam on his book. The less he worked, the more discouraged he got. And the more discouraged he got, the more time he spent in the bar. I'd never seen him drink that way. 6, 7 beers a night, and I didn't want to be around him when he was like that. He was dark, and when he wasn't sulking in silence, he would tell me things I really didn't want to know. "One of these days your mother's gonna leave me," he said one night. "If I don't make something happen pretty soon, I really think she might." I started avoiding him. I'm not sure he even noticed. It became depressingly easy to lie about my comings and goings. Meanwhile, at the Home for Peculiar Children, Miss Peregrine instituted a near lockdown. It was like martial law had been declared. The smaller kids couldn't go anywhere without an escort. The older ones traveled in pairs, and Miss Peregrine had to know where everyone was at all times. Just getting permission to go outside was an ordeal. Sentries were drafted into rotating shifts to watch the front and rear of the house. At all times of the day and most of the night, you could see bored faces peeping out of windows. If they spotted someone approaching, they yanked a pull chain that rang a bell in Miss Peregrine's room, which meant that whenever I arrived, she'd be waiting inside the door to interrogate me. What was happening outside the loop? Had I seen anything strange? Was I sure I hadn't been followed? Not surprisingly, The kids began to go a little nuts. The little ones got rambunctious while the older ones moped, complaining about the new rules in voices just loud enough to be overheard. Dramatic sighs erupted out of thin air, often the only cue that Millard had wandered into a room. Hugh's insects swarmed and stung people until they were banished from the house, after which Hugh spent all his time at the window, his bees screening the other side of the glass. Olive, claiming she had misplaced her leaden shoes, took to crawling around the ceiling like a fly, dropping grains of rice on people's heads until they looked up and noticed her, at which point she'd burst into laughter so all-consuming that her levitation would falter and she'd have to grab onto a chandelier or curtain rod just to keep from falling. Strangest of all was Enoch, who disappeared into his basement laboratory to perform experimental surgeries on his clay soldiers that would have made Dr. Frankenstein cringe. Amputating the limbs from two to make a hideous Spider-Man of a third, or cramming 4 chicken hearts into a single chest cavity in an attempt to create a super Clayman who would never run out of energy. One by one, their little gray bodies failed under the strain, and the basement came to resemble a Civil War field hospital. For her part, Miss Peregrine remained in a constant state of motion, chain-smoking pipes while limping from room to check on the children, as if they might disappear the moment they left her sight. Miss Avocet stayed on, emerging from her torpor now and then to wander the halls, calling out forlornly for her poor, abandoned wards before slumping into someone's arms to be taken back to bed. There followed a great deal of paranoid speculation about Miss Avocet's tragic ordeal, and why Hollows would want to kidnap Imbrins, with theories ranging from the bizarre to create the biggest time loop in history, large enough to swallow the whole planet, to the ridiculously optimistic, to keep the Hollows company. Being a horrible soul-eating monster can get pretty lonely. Eventually, a morbid quiet settled over the house. 2 days of confinement had made everyone lethargic. Believing that routine was the best defense against depression, Miss Peregrine tried to keep everyone interested in her daily lessons, in preparing the daily meals, and in keeping the house spick and span. But whenever they weren't under direct orders to do something, the children sank heavily into chairs, stared listlessly out of locked windows, paged through dog-eared books they'd read 100 times before, or slept. I'd never seen Horace's peculiar talent in action until, one evening, he began to scream. A bunch of us rushed upstairs to the garret, where he'd been on sentry duty, to find him rigid in a chair, in the grips of what seemed to be a waking nightmare, clawing at the air in horror. At first, his screaming was just that, but then he began to babble, yelling about the seas boiling, and ash raining from the sky, and an endless blanket of smoke smothering the earth. After a few minutes of these apocalyptic pronouncements, he seemed to wear himself out, and fell into an uneasy sleep. The others had seen this happen before, often enough that there were photos of his episodes in Miss Peregrine's album, and they knew what to do. Under the headmistress's direction, they carried him by the arms and legs to bed, and when he woke a few hours later, he claimed he couldn't remember the dream, and that dreams he couldn't remember rarely came true. The others accepted this because they already had too much else to worry about. I sensed he was holding something back. When someone goes missing in a town as small as Cairnholm, it doesn't go unnoticed. That's why on Wednesday, when Martin failed to open his museum or stop by the priest hole for his customary nightcap, people began to wonder if he was sick. And when Kev's wife went to check on him and found his front door hanging open and his wallet and glasses on the kitchen counter, but no one at home, people began to wonder if he was dead. When he still hadn't turned up the next day, a gang of men was dispatched to open sheds and peer beneath overturned boats, searching anywhere a wifeless man who loved whiskey might sleep off a binge. But they'd only just begun when a call came in over the short band radio. Martin's body had been fished out of the ocean. I was in the pub with my dad when the fisherman who found him came in. It was hardly past noon, but he was issued a beer on principle, and within minutes the man was telling his story. "I was up at Gannett's Point reeling in my nets," he began. "They was heavy as anything, which was odd, since alls I generally catch out that-a-ways is just tidy little nothings, shrimps and such. Thought I'd got snagged on a crab trap, so I grabbed for the gaff and poke around under the boat till a hook's on something." We all scooted closer on our stools like it was story time in some morbid kindergarten. "It was Martin, all right. Looked like he'd taken a quick trip down a cliffside and got nibbled by sharks. Lord knows what business he had being out by them cliffs in the dead of night in just his robe and trolleys." "He weren't dressed?" Kev asked. "Dressed for bed, maybe," said the fisherman. "Not for a walk in the wet." Brief prayers were muttered for Martin's soul, and then people began trading theories. Within minutes, the place was a smoke-filled den of tipsy Sherlock Holmeses. "He could have been drunk," one man ventured. "Or if he was out by the cliffs, maybe he'd seen the sheep killer and was chasing after," said another. "What about that squirrely new fella?" the fisherman said. "The one who's camping." My father straightened on his bar stool. "I ran into him," he said, 2 nights ago." I turned to him in surprise. "You didn't tell me." "I was going to the chemist trying to catch him before he closed, and this guy's headed the other way out of town. In a huge hurry, I bump his shoulder as he passes, just to ruffle him. He stops and stares at me, trying to be intimidating. I get in his face, tell him I want to know what he's doing here, what he's working on, because people here talk about themselves, I say." Kev leaned across the bar. "And?" "He looks like he's about to take a swing at me, but then just walks off." A lot of the men had questions. What an ornithologist does, why the guy was camping, and other things I already knew. I had only one question, which I'd been itching to ask. "Did you notice anything strange about him? About his face?" My father thought for a second. "Yeah, actually, he had on sunglasses." "At night?" "Weirdest damn thing." A sick feeling came over me, and I wondered how close my father had come to something far worse than a fistfight. I knew I had to tell Miss Peregrine about this, and soon. "Ah, bollocks," said Kev. "There ain't been a murder on Cairnholm in 100 years. Why would anyone want to kill old Martin anyway? It don't make sense. I'll bet you all around that when his autopsy comes back, it says he was arseholed right into the next century." "Could be a tidy spell before that happens," the fisherman said. "Storm that's rolling in now, weatherman says it's gonna be a right bumper. Worst we've had all year." "Weatherman says," Kev scoffed. "I wouldn't trust that silly bugger to know if it's raining now." The islanders often made gloomy predictions about what Mother Nature had in store for Cairnholm. They were at the mercy of the elements, after all, and pessimistic by default. But this time their worst fears were confirmed. The wind and rain that had pelted the island all week strengthened that night into a vicious band of storms that closed blackly over the sky and whipped the sea into foam. Between rumors about Martin having been murdered and the weather, the town went into lockdown, much as the children's home had. People stayed in their houses, windows were shuttered and doors bolted tight. Boats clattered against their moorings in the heavy chop, but none left the harbor. To take one out in such a gale would have been suicidal, and because the mainland police couldn't collect Martin's body until the seas calmed, the townspeople were left with the nettlesome question of what to do with his body. It was finally decided that the fishmonger, who had the island's largest stockpile of ice, would keep him cool in the back of his shop, among salmon and cod and other things, which, like Martin, had been pulled from the sea. I was under strict instructions from my father not to leave the priest hole, but I was also under strict instructions to report any strange goings-on to Miss Peregrine, and if a suspicious death didn't qualify, nothing did. So that night I feigned a flu-like illness and locked myself in my room, then slipped out the window and climbed down a drain pipe to the ground. No one else was foolish enough to be outside, so I ran straight down the main path without fear of being spotted, the hood of my jacket scrunched tight against the whipping rain. When I got to the children's home, Miss Peregrine took one look at me and knew something was wrong. "What's happened?" she said, her bloodshot eyes ranging over me. I told her everything, all the sketchy facts and rumors I'd overheard, and she blanched. She hurried me into the sitting room, where in a panic she gathered all the kids she could find and then stomped off to find a few who had ignored her shouts. The rest were left to stand around, anxious and confused. Emma and Millard cornered me. "What's she in such a tiff about?" Millard asked. I quietly told them about Martin. Millard sucked in his breath, and Emma crossed her arms, looking worried. "Is it really that bad?" I said. "I mean, it can't have been hollows. They only hunt peculiars, right?" Emma groaned. "Do you want to tell him, or should I?" "Hollows vastly prefer peculiars over common folk," Millard explained. "But they'll eat just about anything to sustain themselves, so long as it's fresh and meaty." "It's one of the ways you know there might be a hollow hanging about," said Emma. "The bodies pile up. That's why they're mostly nomads. If they didn't move from place to place so often, they'd be simple to track down." "How often?" I asked, a shiver tracing my spine. "Do they need to eat, I mean?" "Oh, pretty often," said Millard. "Arranging the hollow's meals is what whites spend most of their time doing. They look for peculiars when they can, but a gobsmacking portion of their energy and effort is spent tracking down common victims for the hollows, animal and human, and then hiding the mess." His tone was academic, as if discussing the breeding patterns of a mildly interesting species of rodent. "But don't the whites get caught?" I said. "I mean, if they're helping murder people, you'd think—" "Some do," Emma said. "Wager you've heard of a few if you follow the news. There was one fellow, they found him with human heads in the icebox, and giblety goodies in a stock pot over a low boil like he was making Christmas dinner. In your time, this wouldn't have been so very long ago." I remembered, vaguely, a sensationalized late-night TV special about a cannibalistic serial killer from Milwaukee who'd been apprehended in similarly gruesome circumstances. "You mean Jeffrey Dahmer?" "I believe that was the gentleman's name, yes," said Millard. "Fascinating case. Seems he never lost his taste for the fresh stuff, though he'd not been a hollow for many years." "I thought you guys weren't supposed to know anything about the future," I said. Emma flashed a canny smile. "The bird only keeps good things about the future to herself, but you can bet we hear all the brown trouser bits." Then Miss Peregrine returned, pulling Enoch and Horace behind her by the shirt sleeves. Everyone came to attention. "We've just had word of a new threat," she announced, giving me an appreciative nod. "A man outside our loop has died under suspicious circumstances. We can't be certain of the cause or whether it represents a true threat to our security, but we must conduct ourselves as if it did. Until further notice, no one may leave the house, not even to collect vegetables or bring in a goose for the evening meal." A collective groan arose, over which Miss Peregrine raised her voice. "This has been a challenging few days for us all. I beg your continued patience." Hands shot up around the room, but she rebuffed all questions and marched off to secure the doors. I ran after her in a panic. If there really was something dangerous on the island, it might kill me the minute I set foot outside the loop. But if I stayed here, I'd be leaving my father defenseless, not to mention worried sick about me. Somehow, that seemed even worse. "I need to go," I said, catching up to Miss Peregrine. She pulled me into an empty room and closed the door. "You will keep your voice down," she commanded, "and you will respect my rules. What I said applies to you as well. No one leaves this house, but thus far I have allowed you an unprecedented measure of autonomy to come and go as you please, out of respect for your unique position. But you may have already been followed here, and that puts my wards' lives in jeopardy. I will not permit you to endanger them or yourself any further." "Don't you understand?" I said angrily. "Boats aren't running. Those people in town are stuck. My father is stuck. If there really is a white, and it's who I think it is, he and my dad have almost gotten into one fight already. If he just fed a total stranger to a hollow, who do you think he's going after next?" Her face was like stone. "The welfare of the townspeople is none of my concern," she said. "I won't endanger my wards. Not for anyone." "It isn't just townspeople, it's my father. Do you really think a couple of locked doors will stop me from going?" "Perhaps not. But if you insist on leaving here, then I insist you never return." I was so shocked I had to laugh. "But you need me," I said. "Yes, we do," she replied. "We do very much." I stormed upstairs to Emma's room. Inside was a tableau of frustration that might have been straight out of Norman Rockwell, if Norman Rockwell had painted people doing hard time in jail. Bronwyn stared woodenly out the window. Enoch sat on the floor, whittling a piece of hard clay. Emma was perched on the edge of her bed, elbows on knees, tearing sheets of paper from a notebook and igniting them between her fingers. "You're back," she said when I came in. "I never left," I replied. "Miss Peregrine wouldn't let me." Everyone listened as I explained my dilemma. "I'm banished if I try to leave." Emma's entire notebook ignited. "She can't do that," she cried, oblivious to the flames licking her hand. "She can do what she likes," said Bronwyn. "She's the bird." Emma threw down her book and stamped out the fire. "I just came to tell you I'm going, whether she wants me to or not. I won't be held prisoner, and I won't bury my head in the sand while my own father might be in real danger." "Then I'm coming with you," Emma said. "You ain't serious," replied Bronwyn. "I am." "What you are is 3/4 stupid," said Enoch. "You'll turn into a wrinkled old prune, and for what? Him?" "I won't," said Emma. "You've got to be out of the loop for hours and hours before time starts to catch up with you, and it won't take nearly that long. Will it, Jacob?" "It's a bad idea," I said. "What's a bad idea?" said Enoch. "She don't even know what she's risking her life to do." "Headmistress won't like it," said Bronwyn, stating the obvious. "She'll kill us, Em." Emma stood up and shut the door. "She won't kill us," she said. "Those things will. And if they don't, living like this might just be worse than dying. The bird's got us cooped up so tight we can hardly breathe, and all because she doesn't have the spleen to face whatever's out there." "Or not out there," said Millard, who I hadn't realized was in the room with us. "But she won't like it," Bronwyn repeated. Emma took a combative step towards her friend. "How long can you hide under the hem of that woman's skirt?" "Have you already forgotten what's happened to Miss Avocet?" said Millard. "It was only when her wards left the loop that they were killed, and Miss Bunting kidnapped. If they'd only stayed put, nothing bad would have happened." "Nothing bad?" Emma said dubiously. "Yes, it's true that hollows can't go through loops, but whites can, which is just how those kids were tricked into leaving. Should we sit on our bums and wait for them to come through our front door? What if rather than clever disguises, this time they bring guns?" "That's what I'd do," Enoch said. "Wait till everyone's asleep, then slide down the chimney like Santa Claus, and blam!" He fired an imaginary pistol at Emma's pillow. "Brains on the wall." "Thank you for that," Millard said, sighing. "We've got to hit them before they know we know they're there," said Emma, "while we've still got the element of surprise." "But we don't know they're there," said Millard. "We'll find out." "And how do you propose to do that? Wander around until you see a hollow? What then? Excuse me, we were wondering what your intentions might be vis-a-vis eating us." "We've got Jacob," said Bronwyn. "He can see them." I felt my throat tighten, aware that if this hunting party formed, I would be in some way responsible for everyone's safety. "I've only ever seen one," I warned them, "so I wouldn't exactly call myself an expert." "And if he shouldn't happen to see one," said Millard, "it could either mean that there are none to be seen, or that they're hiding. You'd still be clueless, as you so clearly are now." Furrowed brows all around. Millard had a point. "Well, it appears that logic has prevailed yet again," he said. "I'm off to fetch some porridge for supper, if any of you would-be mutineers would like to join me." The bed springs creaked as he got up and moved toward the door, but before he could leave, Enoch leapt to his feet and cried, "I've got it!" Millard stopped. "Got what?" Enoch turned to me. "The bloke who may or may not have been eaten by a hollow. Do you know where they're keeping him?" "At the fishmonger's." He rubbed his hands together. "Then I know how we can be sure." "And how's that?" said Millard. "We'll ask him." An expeditionary team was assembled. Joining me would be Emma, who flatly refused to let me go alone, Bronwyn, who was loath to anger Miss Peregrine, but insisted that we needed her protection, and Enoch, whose plan we were to carry out. Millard, whose invisibility might have come in handy, would have no part of it, and he had to be bribed just to keep from ratting us out. "If we all go," Emma reasoned, "the bird won't be able to banish Jacob. She'll have to banish all four of us." "But I don't want to be banished," said Bronwyn. "She'd never do it, Win. That's the point. And if we can make it back before lights out, she may not even realize we were gone." I had my doubts about that, but we all agreed it was worth a shot. It went down like a jailbreak. After dinner, when the house was at its most chaotic and Miss Peregrine at her most distracted, Emma pretended to head for the sitting room and I for the study. We met a few minutes later at the end of the upstairs hallway, where a rectangle of ceiling pulled down to reveal a ladder. Emma climbed it and I followed, pulling it closed after us, and we found ourselves in a tiny, dark attic space. At one end was a vent, easily unscrewed, that led out onto a flat section of roof. We stepped into the night air to find the others already waiting. Bronwyn gave us each a crushing hug and handed out black rain slickers she'd snagged, which I'd suggested we wear to provide some measure of protection from the storm raging outside the loop. I was about to ask how we were planning to reach the ground when I saw Olive float into view past the edge of the roof. "Who's keen for a game of parachute?" she said, smiling broadly. She was barefoot and wore a rope knotted around her waist. Curious what she was attached to, I peeked over the roof to see Fiona, rope in hand, hanging out a window and waving up at me. Apparently, we had accomplices. "You first," Enoch barked. "Me?" I said, backing nervously away from the edge. "Grab hold of Olive and jump," Emma said. "I don't remember this plan involving me shattering my pelvis." "You won't, dummy, if you just hang on to Olive. It's great fun. We've done it loads of times." She thought for a moment. "Well, one time." There seemed to be no alternative, so I steeled myself and approached the roof's edge. "Don't be frightened," Olive said. "Easy for you to say," I replied. "You can't fall." She reached out her arms and bear-hugged me, and I hugged her back, and she whispered, "Okay, go." I closed my eyes and stepped into the void. Instead of the drop I'd feared, we drifted slowly to the ground like a balloon leaking helium. "That was fun," Olive said. "Now let go." I did, and she went rocketing back up to the roof, saying, "Whee!" all the way. The others shushed her, and then one after another, they hugged her and floated down to join me. When we were all together, we began sneaking toward the moon-capped woods, Fiona and Olive waving behind us. Maybe it was my imagination, but the breeze-blown topiary creatures seemed to wave at us too, with Adam nodding a somber farewell. When we stopped at the bog's edge to catch our breath, Enoch reached into his bulging coat and handed out packages wrapped in cheesecloth. "Take these," he said. "I ain't carrying 'em all." "What are they?" asked Bronwyn, undoing the cloth to reveal a hunk of brownish meat with little tubes shunting out of it. "Ugh! It stinks!" she cried, holding it away from her. "Calm down, it's only a sheep heart," he said, thrusting something of roughly the same dimensions into my hands. It stank of formaldehyde, and even through the cloth felt unpleasantly moist. "I'll chuck my guts if I have to carry this," Bronwyn said. "I'd like to see that," Enoch grumbled, sounding offended. "Stash it in your slicker and let's get on with it." We followed the hidden ribbon of solid ground through the bog. I'd been over it so many times now, I'd almost forgotten how dangerous it could be, how many lives it had swallowed over the centuries. Stepping onto the cairn mound, I told everyone to button up their coats. "What if we see someone?" asked Enoch. "Just act normal," I said. "I'll tell them you're my friends from America." "What if we see a white?" asked Bronwyn. "Run." "And if Jacob sees a hollow?" "In that case," Emma said, "run like the devil's after you." One by one we ducked into the cairn, disappearing from that calm summer night. All was quiet until we reached the end chamber, and then the air pressure dropped, and the temperature fell, and the storm screamed into full-throated being. We spun toward the sound, rattled, and for a moment just stood listening as it seethed and howled at the mouth of the tunnel. It sounded like a caged animal that had just been shown its dinner. There was nothing to do but offer ourselves up to it. We fell to our knees and crawled into what seemed like a black hole, the stars lost behind a mountain of thunderheads, whipping rain and freezing wind rifling through our coats, wires of lightning bleaching us bone white and making the dark that followed seem darker still. Emma tried to make a flame, but she looked like a broken cigarette lighter, every sparking flick of her wrist hissing out before it could catch. So we shrugged up our coats and ran, bent against the gale, in the swollen bog that sucked at our legs, navigating as much by memory as by sight. In the town, rain drummed on every door and window, but everyone stayed locked and shuttered inside their cottages as we ran unnoticed through the flooding streets, past scattered roof tiles torn away by the wind, past a single rain-blinded sheep lost and crying, past a tipped outhouse disgorging itself into the road to the fishmonger's shop. The door was locked, but with 2 thudding kicks, Bronwyn flung it in. Drying her hand inside her coat, Emma was finally able to make a flame. As wide-eyed sturgeon stared from glass cases, I led us into the shop, around the counter where Dylan spent his days mumbling curses and scaling fish through a rust-pocked door. On the other side was a little ice house, just a lean-to shed, floored with dirt and roofed with tin, its walls made from rough-cut planks, rain weeping through where they shivered apart like bad teeth. Crowding the room were a dozen rectangular troughs, raised on sawhorses and filled with ice. "Which one's he in?" Enoch asked. "I don't know," I said. Emma shone her flame around as we walked among the troughs, trying to guess which might hold more than just the corpses of fish, but they all looked the same. Just lidless coffins of ice. We would have to search every one until we found him. "Not me," Bronwyn said. "I don't want to see him. I don't like dead things." "Neither do I, but we have to," said Emma. "We're all in this together." Each of us chose a trough and dug into it like a dog excavating a prized bed of flowers, our cupped hands scooping mounds of ice onto the floor. I'd emptied half of one and was losing feeling in my fingers when I heard Bronwyn shriek. I turned to see her stumble away from a trough, her hands across her mouth. We crowded around to see what she'd uncovered. Jutting from the ice was a frozen, hairy-knuckled hand. "I dare say you found our man," Enoch said, and through split fingers the rest of us watched as he scraped away more ice, slowly revealing an arm, then a torso, and finally Martin's entire wrecked body. It was an awful sight. His limbs were twisted in improbable directions. His trunk had been scissored open and emptied out, ice filling the cavity where his vitals had been. When his face appeared, there was a collective intake of breath. Half was a purple contusion that hung in strips like a shredded mask. The other was just undamaged enough to recognize him by. A jaw stippled with beard, a jigsawed section of cheek and brow, and one green eye filmed over and gazing emptily. He wore only boxers and ragged scraps of a terry cloth robe. There was no way he'd walked by himself out to the cliffs at night dressed like that. Someone, or something, had dragged him there. "He's pretty far gone," said Enoch, appraising Martin as a surgeon might assess an all but hopeless patient. "I'm telling you now, this might not work." "We've got to try," Bronwyn said, stepping bravely to the trough with the rest of us. "We come all this way. We at least got to try." Enoch opened his slicker and pulled out one of the wrapped hearts from an interior pocket. It looked like a maroon catcher's mitt folded in on itself. "If he wakes up," Enoch said, "he ain't gonna be happy. So just stand back and don't say I didn't warn you." All of us took a generous step back except Enoch, who bellied up to the trough and plunged his arm into the ice that filled Martin's chest, swirling it around like he was fishing for a can of soda in a cooler. After a moment, he seemed to latch onto something, and with his other hand he raised the sheep heart above his head. A sudden convulsion passed through Enoch's body, and the sheep heart started to beat, spraying out a fine mist of bloody pickling solution. Enoch took fast, shallow breaths. He seemed to be channeling something. I studied Martin's body for any hint of movement, but he lay still. Gradually, the heart in Enoch's hand began to slow and shrink, its color fading to a blackish gray, like meat left too long in the freezer. Enoch threw it on the ground and thrust his empty hand at me. I pulled out the heart I'd been keeping in my pocket and gave it to him. He repeated the same process, the heart pumping and sputtering for a while before faltering like the last one. Then he did it a third time, using the heart he'd given to Emma. Bronwyn's heart was the only one left, Enoch's last chance. His face took on a new intensity as he raised it above Martin's rude coffin, squeezing it like he meant to drive his fingers through. As the heart began to shake and tremble like an overcranked motor, Enoch shouted, "Rise up, dead man! Rise up!" I saw a flicker of movement. Something had shifted beneath the ice. I leaned as close as I could stand to, watching for any sign of life. For a long moment there was nothing, but then the body wrenched as suddenly and forcefully as if it had been shocked with 1,000 volts. Emma screamed and we all jumped back. When I lowered my arms to look again, Martin's head had turned in my direction, one cataract eye wheeling crazily before fixing, it seemed, on me. "He sees you," Enoch cried. I leaned in. The dead man smelled of turned earth and brine, and something worse. Ice fell away from his hand, which rose up to tremble in the air for a moment, afflicted and blue before coming to rest on my arm. I fought the urge to throw it off. His lips fell apart and his jaw hinged open. I bent down to hear him, but there was nothing to hear. Of course there isn't, I thought. His lungs have burst. But then a tiny sound leaked out, and I leaned closer, my ear almost to his freezing lips. I thought, strangely, of the rain gutter by my house, where if you put your head to the bars and wait for a break in traffic, you can just make out the whisper of an underground stream, buried when the town was first built, but still flowing, imprisoned in a permanent night. The others crowded around, but I was the only one who could hear the dead man. The first thing he said was my name. "Jacob." Fear shot through me. "Yes?" "I was dead." The words came slowly, dripping like molasses. He corrected himself. "Am dead." "Tell me what happened," I said. "Can you remember?" There was a pause. The wind whistled through the gaps in the walls. He said something and I missed it. "Say it again, please, Martin." "He killed me," the dead man whispered. "Who?" "My old man." "You mean Augie? Your uncle?" "My old man," he said again. "He got big and strong. So strong." "Who did, Martin?" His eye closed and I feared he was gone for good. I looked at Enoch. He nodded. The heart in his hand was still beating. Martin's eye flicked beneath its lid. He began to speak again, slowly but evenly, as if reciting something. "For 100 generations he slept, curled like a fetus in the earth's mysterious womb, digested by roots, fermenting in the dark, summer fruits, canned and forgotten in the larder, until a farmer's spade bore him out, rough midwife to a strange harvest." Martin paused, his lips trembling, and in the brief silence, Emma looked at me and whispered, "What's he saying?" "I don't know," I said, "but it sounds like a poem." He continued, his voice wavering but loud enough now that everyone could hear. "Blackly he reposes, tender face the color of soot, withered limbs like veins of coal, feet lumps of driftwood hung with shriveled grapes." And finally, I recognized the poem. It was the one he'd written about the bog boy. "Oh, Jacob, I took such good, careful care of him," he said. "Dusted the glass and changed the soil and made him a home, like my own big bruised baby. I took such careful care, but—" He began to shake, and a tear ran down his cheek and froze there. "But he killed me." "Do you mean the bog boy? The old man?" "Send me back," he pleaded. "It hurts." His cold hand kneaded my shoulder, his voice fading again. I looked to Enoch for help. He tightened his grip on the heart and shook his head. "Quick now, mate," he said. Then I realized something. Though he was describing the bog boy, it wasn't the bog boy who had killed him. They only become visible to the rest of us when they're eating, Miss Peregrine had told me, which is to say, when it's too late. Martin had seen a hologast at night in the rain as it was tearing him to shreds and had mistaken it for his most prized exhibit. The old fear began to pump, coating my insides with heat. I turned to the others. "A hologast did this to him," I said. "It's somewhere on the island." "Ask him where," said Enoch. "Martin, where? I need to know where you saw it." "Please, it hurts." "Where did you see it?" "He came to my door." "The old man did?" His breath hitched strangely. He was hard to look at, but I made myself do it, following his eye as it shifted and focused on something behind me. "No," he said. "He did." And then a light swept over us, and a loud voice barked. "Who's there?" Emma closed her hand and the flame hissed out, and we all spun to see a man standing in the doorway, holding a flashlight in one hand and a pistol in the other. Enoch yanked his arm out of the ice while Emma and Bronwyn closed ranks around the trough to block Martin from view.
"We didn't mean to break in," Bronwyn said. "We was just leaving. Honest."
"Stay where you are," the man shouted. His voice was flat, accentless. I couldn't see his face through the beam of light, but the layered jackets he wore were an instant giveaway. It was the ornithologist. "Mister, we hain't had nothing to eat all day," Enoch whined, for once sounding like a 12-year-old. "All we come for was a fish or two, swear." "Is that so?" said the man. "Looks like you've picked one out. Let's see what kind." He waved his flashlight back and forth as if to part us with the beam. "Step aside." We did, and he swept the light over Martin's body, a landscape of garish ruin. "Goodness, that's an odd-looking fish, isn't it?" he said, entirely unfazed. "Must be a fresh one. He's still moving." The beam came to rest on Martin's face. His eye rolled back and his lips moved soundlessly, just a reflex as the life Enoch had given him drained away.
"Who are you?" Bronwyn demanded.
"That depends on whom you ask," the man replied. "And it isn't nearly as important as the fact that I know who you are." He pointed the flashlight at each of us and spoke as if quoting some secret dossier. "Emma Bloom, a spark, abandoned at a circus when her parents couldn't sell her to one. Bronwyn Bruntley, berserker, taster of blood, didn't know her own strength until the night she snapped her rotten stepfather's neck. Enoch O'Connor, dead riser, born to a family of undertakers who couldn't understand why their clients kept walking away." I saw each of them shrink away from him. Then he shone the light at me. "And Jacob. Such peculiar company you're keeping these days." "How do you know my name?" He cleared his throat, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed radically. "Did you forget me so quick?" he said in a New England accent. "But then I'm just a poor old bus driver. Guess you wouldn't remember." It seemed impossible, but somehow this man was doing a dead-on impression of my middle school bus driver, Mr. Barron, a man so despised, so foul-tempered, so robotically inflexible, that on the last day of 8th grade, we defaced his yearbook picture with staples and left it like an effigy behind his seat. I was just remembering what he used to say as I got off the bus every afternoon when the man before me sang it out. "End of the line, Portman." "Mr. Barron?" I asked doubtfully, struggling to see his face through the flashlight beam. The man laughed and cleared his throat, his accent changing again. "Either him or the yard man," he said in a deep Florida drawl. "Yon trees need a haircut, give you a good price." It was the pitch-perfect voice of the man who for years had maintained my family's lawn and cleaned our pool. "How are you doing that?" I said. "How do you know those people?" "Because I am those people," he said, his accent flat again. He laughed, relishing my baffled horror. Something occurred to me. Had I ever seen Mr. Barron's eyes? Not really. He was always wearing those giant old man sunglasses that wrapped around his face. The yard man wore sunglasses too, and a wide-brimmed hat. Had I ever given either of them a hard look? How many other roles in my life had this chameleon played? "What's happening?" Emma said. "Who is this man?" "Shut up," he snapped. "You'll get your turn." "You've been watching me?" I said. "You killed those sheep. You killed Martin." "Who, me?" he said innocently. "I didn't kill anyone." "But you're a white, aren't you?" "That's their word," he said. I couldn't understand it. I hadn't seen the yard man since my mother replaced him 3 years ago, and Mr. Barron had vanished from my life after 8th grade. Had he really been following me? "How'd you know where to find me?" "Why, Jacob," he said, his voice changing yet again. You told me yourself. In confidence, of course. It was a Middle American accent now, soft and educated. He tipped the flashlight up so that its glow spilled onto his face. The beard I'd seen him wearing the other day was gone. Now there was no mistaking him. Dr. Golden, I said, my voice a whisper, swallowed by the drumming rain. I thought back to our telephone conversation a few days ago. The noise in the background. He'd said he was at the airport, but he wasn't picking up his sister. He was coming after me. I backed against Martin's trough, reeling, numbness spreading through me. The neighbor, I said. The old man watering his lawn, the night my grandfather died. That was you too. He smiled. But your eyes, I said. Contact lenses, he replied. He popped one out with his thumb, revealing a blank orb. Amazing what they can fabricate these days. And if I may anticipate a few more of your questions, yes, I am a licensed therapist. The minds of common people have long fascinated me, and no, despite the fact that our sessions were predicated on a lie, I don't think they were a complete waste of time. In fact, I may be able to continue helping you. Or, rather, we may be able to help each other. Please, Jacob, Emma said. Don't listen to him. Don't worry, I said. I trusted him once. I won't make that mistake again. Golan continued as though he hadn't heard me. I can offer you safety, money. I can give you your life back, Jacob. All you have to do is work with us. Us? Malthus and me, he said, turning to call over her shoulder. Come and say hello, Malthus. A shadow appeared in the doorway behind him, and a moment later we were overcome by a noxious wave of stench. Bronwyn gagged and fell back a step, and I saw Emma's fist clench as if she were thinking about charging it. I touched her arm and mouthed, Wait. This is all I'm proposing, Golan continued, trying to sound reasonable. Help us find more people like you. In return, you'll have nothing to fear from Malthus or his kind. You can live at home. In your free time, you'll come with me and see the world, and we'll pay you handsomely. We'll tell your parents you're my research assistant. If I agree, I said, what happens to my friends? He made a dismissive gesture with his gun. They made their choice long ago. What's important is that there's a grand plan in motion, Jacob, and you'll be part of it. Did I consider it? I suppose I must have, if only for a moment. Dr. Golan was offering me exactly what I was looking for. A third option, a future that was neither stay here forever, nor leave and die. But one look at my friends, their faces etched with worry, banished any temptation. Well, said Golan, what's your answer? I'd die before I did anything to help you. Ah, he said. But you already have helped me. He began to back toward the door. It's a pity we won't have any more sessions together, Jacob. Though it isn't a total loss, I suppose. The four of you together might be enough to finally shift old Malthus out of the debased form he's been stuck in so long. Oh no, Enoch whimpered. I don't want to be eaten. Don't cry, it's degrading, snapped Bronwyn. We'll just have to kill them, that's all. Wish I could stay and watch, Golan said from the doorway. I do love to watch. And then he was gone, and we were alone with it. I could hear the creature breathing in the dark, a viscid leaking like faulty pipeworks. We each took a step back, then another, until our shoulders met the wall and we stood together like condemned prisoners before a firing squad. I need a light, I whispered to Emma, who was in such shock that she seemed to have forgotten her own power. Her hand came ablaze, and among the flickering shadows I saw it, lurking among the troughs. My nightmare. It stooped there, hairless and naked, mottled gray-black skin hanging off its frame in loose folds, its eyes collared and dripping putrefaction, legs bowed and feet clubbed, and hands gnarled into useless claws, every part looking withered and wasted like the body of an impossibly old man, save one. Its outsized jaws were its main feature, a bulging enclosure of teeth as tall and sharp as little steak knives that the flesh of its mouth was hopeless to contain, so that its lips were perpetually drawn back in a deranged smile. And then those awful teeth came unlocked, its mouth reeling open to admit 3 wiry tongues into the air, each as thick as my wrist. They unspooled across half the room's length, 10 feet or more, and then hung there, wriggling, the creature breathing raggedly through a pair of leprous holes in its face, as if tasting our scent, considering how best to devour us. That we would be so easy to kill was the only reason we weren't dead already, like a gourmand about to enjoy a fine meal. There was no reason to rush things. The others couldn't see it in the way I did, but recognized its shadow projected on the wall and that of its rope-like tongues. Emma flexed her arm, and her flame burned brighter.
"What's it doing?" she whispered. "Why hasn't it come at us?"
"It's playing with us," I said. "It knows we're trapped."
"We ain't any such thing," Bronwyn muttered. "Just give me one square go at its face. I'll punch its bloody teeth in."
"I wouldn't get anywhere near those teeth if I were you," I said. The hollow took a few lumbering steps forward to match the ones we'd taken back, its tongues unfurling more and then splitting apart, one coming towards me, another towards Enoch, and the third towards Emma.
"Leave us be!" Emma yelled, lashing out with her hand like a torch.
The tongue twisted away from her flame, then inched back like a snake preparing to strike. "We've got to try for the door," I yelled. "The hollow's by the 3rd trough from the left, so keep to the right." "We'll never make it," Enoch cried. One of the tongues touched him on the cheek, and he screamed.
"We'll go on 3, Emma shouted. 1,
and then Bronwyn launched herself toward the creature, howling like a banshee. The creature shrieked and reared up, its bunched skin pulling tight. Just as it was about to lash its trident of tongues at her, she rammed Martin's ice trough with the full weight of her body and levered her arms under it as it tipped, and then heaved it and the whole huge thing, full of ice and fish and Martin's body, careened through the air and fell upon the hollow with a terrific crash. Bronwyn spun and bounded back in our direction. "Move!" she cried, and I leapt away as she collided with the wall beside me, kicking a hole through the rotten planks. Enoch, the smallest of us, dove through first, followed by Emma, and before I could protest, Bronwyn had grabbed me by the shoulders and tossed me out into the wet night. I landed chest first in a puddle. The cold was shocking, but I was elated to feel anything other than the hollow's tongue wrapping around my throat. Emma and Enoch hauled me to my feet, and we took off running. A moment later, Emma shouted Bronwyn's name and stopped. We turned, realizing she hadn't come with us. We called for her and scanned the dark, not quite brave enough to run back, and then Enoch shouted, "There!" and we saw Bronwyn leaning against a corner of the ice house.
"What's she doing?" cried Emma. "Bronwyn, run!"
It looked as though she was hugging the building. Then she stepped back and took a running start and rammed her shoulder into its corner support, and like a house made of matchsticks, the whole thing tumbled in on itself, a cloud of pulverized ice and splintered wood puffing out and blowing down the street in a gust of wind. We all hollered and cheered as Bronwyn sprinted towards us with a manic grin on her face, then stood in the pelting rain, hugging her and laughing. It didn't take long for our moods to darken, though, as the shock of what had just happened set in, and then Emma turned to me and asked the question that must have been on all of their minds.
"Jacob, how did that white know so much about you? And us?"
"You called him Doctor," said Enoch.
"He was my psychiatrist."
"Psychiatrist?" Enoch said. That's just grand. Not only did he betray us to a white, he's mad to boot.
Take it back, Emma yelled, shoving him hard.
He was about to shove back when I stepped between them. Stop, I said, pushing them apart. I faced Enoch.
You're wrong. I'm not crazy. He let me think I was, though all along he must have known I was peculiar. You're right about one thing, though. I did betray you. I told my grandfather's stories to a stranger. It's not your fault, Emma said. You couldn't have known we were real.
Of course he could have, shouted Enoch. Abe told him everything, even showed him bloody pictures of us.
Golan knew everything but how to find you, I said, and I led him straight here. But he tricked you, said Bronwyn. I just want you to know that I'm sorry.
Emma hugged me.
It's all right. We're alive.
For now, said Enoch. But that maniac is still out there, and considering how willing he was to feed us all to his pet Hallowgas, it's a good bet he's figured out how to get into the loop on his own.
Oh God, you're right, said Emma.
Well then, I said,
we'd better get there before he does.
And before it does, Bronwyn added. We turned to see her pointing at the wrecked ice house, where broken boards had begun to shift in the collapsed pile.
I imagine he'll be coming for us directly, and I'm fresh out of houses to drop on him.
Someone shouted, "Run!" but we already were, tearing down the path toward the one place the hollow couldn't reach us, the loop. We raced out of town in the spitting dark, vague blue outlines of cottages giving way to sloping fields, then charged up the ridge, sheets of water streaming over our feet, making the path treacherous. Enoch slipped and fell. We hauled him up and ran on. As we were about to crest the ridge, Bronwyn's feet went out from under her too, and she slid down 20 feet before she could stop herself. Emma and I ran back to help, and as we took her arms, I turned to look behind us, hoping to catch a glimpse of the creature. But there was only inky, swirling rain. My talent for spotting hollows wasn't much good without light to see them by. But then as we made it back to the top, chests heaving, a long flash of lightning lit up the night, and I turned and saw it. It was off below us a ways, but climbing fast, its muscular tongues punching into the mud and propelling it up the ridge like a spider. "Go!" I shouted, and we all bolted down the far side, the four of us sliding on our butts until we hit level ground and could run again. There was another flash of lightning. It was even closer than before. At this rate, there was no way we'd be able to outrun it. Our only hope was to outmaneuver it. "If it catches us, it'll kill us all," I shouted. "But if we split up, it'll have to choose. I'll lead it around the long way and try to lose it in the bog. The rest of you get to the loop as quick as you can."
"You're mad," shouted Emma. "If anyone stays behind, it should be me. I can fight it with fire."
"Not in this rain," I said, "and not if you can't see it."
"I won't let you kill yourself," she shouted.
There was no time to argue, so Bronwyn and Enoch ran ahead while Emma and I veered off the path, hoping the creature would follow. And it did. It was close enough now that I didn't need a lightning flash to know where it was. The twist in my gut was enough. We ran arm in arm, tripping through a field rent with furrows and ditches, falling and catching each other in an epileptic dance. I was scanning the ground for rocks to use as weapons when, out of the darkness ahead, there appeared a structure. A small, sagging shack with broken windows and missing doors, which in my panic I failed to recognize. "We have to hide," I said between gasping breaths. "Please let this creature be stupid," I prayed as we sprinted toward the house. "Please, please let it be stupid." We made a wide arc, hoping to enter it unseen. "Wait!" Emma cried as we rounded the back of it. She pulled one of Enoch's cheesecloths from her coat and quickly tied it around a stone plucked from the ground, making a kind of slingshot. She cradled it in her hands until it caught fire and then hurled it away from us. It landed in the boggy distance, glowing weakly in the dark.
"Misdirection,"
she explained, and we turned and committed ourselves to the shack's concealing gloom. We slipped through a door that was hanging off its hinges and stepped down into a sea of dark, aromatic muck. As our feet sank with a nauseating squelch, I realized where we were.
"What is this?"
Emma whispered, and then a sudden exhalation of animal breath made us both jump. The house was crowded with sheep, taking shelter from the unfriendly night, just as we were. As our eyes adjusted, we caught the dull gleam of theirs staring back up at us, dozens and dozens of them.
"It's what I think it is, isn't it?"
she said, lifting one foot gingerly.
"Don't think about it,"
I replied.
"Come on, we need to get away from this door."
I took her hand and we pushed into the house, snaking through a maze of skittish animals that shied from our touch. We threaded a narrow hall and came into a room with one high window and a door that was still in its frame and closed against the night, which was more than could be said for the other rooms. Squeezing into the far corner, we knelt down to wait and listen, hidden behind a wall of nervous sheep. We tried not to sit too deeply in the muck, but there was really no helping it. After a minute of staring blindly into the dark, I began to make out shapes in the room. There were crates and boxes stacked in one corner, and along the wall behind us hung rusted tools. I looked for anything that might be sharp enough to serve as a weapon. Seeing something that looked like a pair of giant scissors, I stood up to grab it.
"Planning on shearing some sheep?" said Emma.
"It's better than nothing." Just as I was taking the shears down from the wall, a noise came from outside the window. The sheep bleated anxiously, and then a long black tongue drifted through the glassless enclosure. I sank back to the floor as quietly as I could. Emma put her hand over her mouth to silence her breathing. The tongue poked around the room like a periscope, seeming to test the air. Luckily, we'd taken refuge in the most fragrant room on the island. All that sheep aroma must have masked our scent, because after a minute, the creature seemed to give up and reeled out the window. We heard its retreating steps. Emma's hand came away from her mouth, and she let out a shuddering breath.
"I think it's taking the bait," she whispered.
"I want you to know something," I said. "If we make it through this, I'm staying." She grabbed my hand.
"Do you mean it?"
"I can't go home. Not after all that's happened. Anyway, whatever help I can be, I owe you that and a lot more. You were all perfectly safe until I got here."
"If we make it through this,"
she said, leaning into me,
"then I don't regret one thing."
And then some strange magnet was pulling our heads together, but just as our lips were about to touch, the quiet was shattered by terrified, bleating shrieks from the next room. We pulled apart as the awful noise set the sheep around us into frantic motion, bounding off one another and pushing us into the wall. The beast was not as dumb as I'd hoped. We could hear it coming towards us through the house. If there was a time to run, it had already passed, so we screwed ourselves into the reeking soil and prayed it would pass us by. And then I could smell it, even more pungent than the house's other stinks, and I could feel it at the threshold of the room. All the sheep pushed away from the door at once, herding together like a school of fish and pinning us against the wall so hard the breath was pressed out of us. We gripped each other but didn't dare make a sound, and for an unbearably tense moment, we heard only the bleating of sheep and the clop of staggering hooves. Then another hoarse scream erupted, sudden and desperate, and just as suddenly silenced, broken off by lurid, ripping bone snap. I knew without looking that a sheep had just been torn apart. Chaos broke out. Panicked animals ricocheted off one another, throwing us against the wall so many times I got dizzy. The hollow let out an ear-splitting screech and began to lift sheep to its slavering jaws, one after another, taking a blood-splurting bite from each and then tossing it aside like a gluttonous king gorging at a medieval feast. It did this again and again, killing its way towards us. I was paralyzed with fear. That's why I can't quite explain what happened next. My every instinct screamed to stay hidden, to dig myself even deeper into the muck, but then one clear thought cut through all that static. I won't let us die in this shit house. And I pushed Emma behind the biggest sheep I could see and bolted for the door. The door was closed and 10 feet away, and a lot of animals stood between it and me, but I plowed through them like a linebacker. I hit the door with my shoulder and it flung open. I tumbled outside into the rain and screamed, "Come get me, you ugly bastard!" I knew I had its attention because it let out a terrifying howl, and sheep came flushing out the door past me. I scrambled to my feet, and when I was sure it was coming after me and not Emma, I took off toward the bog. I could feel it behind me. I might have run faster, but I was still holding the shears. I couldn't seem to make myself let go, and then the ground went soft beneath me, and I knew I'd reached the bog. Twice the hollow was close enough for its tongues to lash my back, and twice, just as I was certain one was about to lasso my neck and squeeze until my head popped, it stumbled and fell back. The only reason I made it to the cairn with my head still attached was that I knew exactly where to put my feet. Thanks to Emma, I could run that route on a moonless night in half a hurricane. Clambering onto the cairn mound, I tore around to the stone entrance and dove in. It was black as tar inside, but it didn't matter. I only had to reach the chamber to be safe. I scrambled on my hands and knees because even standing would have cost time I didn't have to waste, and I was halfway to the end and feeling cautiously optimistic about my chances for survival when suddenly I could crawl no more. One of the tongues had caught my ankle. The hollow had used 2 of its tongues to grapple onto the capstones around the tunnel's mouth as leverage against the mud, and it covered the entrance with its body like a lid on a jar. The 3rd tongue was reeling me towards it. I was a fish on a hook. I scrabbled at the ground, but it was all gravel, and my fingers slid right through. I flipped onto my back and clawed at the stones with my free hand, but I was sliding too quickly. I tried hacking at the tongue with my shears, but it was too sinewy and tough, a rope of undulating muscle, and my shears too dull. So I squeezed my eyes shut because I didn't want its gaping jaws to be the last thing I'd ever see, and gripped the shears in front of me with both hands. Time seemed to stretch out, like they say it does in car crashes and train accidents and free falls from airplanes, and the next thing I felt was a bone-jarring collision as I slammed into the hollow. All the breath rushed out of me, and I heard it scream. We flew out of the tunnel together and rolled down the cairn mound into the bog, and when I opened my eyes again, I saw my shears buried to the hilt in the beast's eye sockets. It howled like 10 pigs being gelded, rolling and thrashing in the rain-swollen mud, weeping a black river of itself, viscous fluid pumping over the blade's rusted handle. I could feel it dying, the life draining out of it, its tongue loosening around my ankle. I could feel the difference in me, too, the panicky clutch in my stomach, slowly coming undone. Finally, the creature stiffened and sank from view, slime closing over its head, a slick of dark blood the only sign it had ever been there. I could feel the bog sucking me down with it. The more I struggled, the more it seemed to want me. What a strange find the 2 of us would make 1,000 years from now, I thought, preserved together in the peat. I tried to paddle towards solid ground, but succeeded only in pushing myself deeper. The muck seemed to climb me, rising up my arms, my chest, collaring my throat like a noose. I screamed for help, and miraculously, help came, in the form of what I thought at first was a firefly, flashing as it flew toward me. Then I heard Emma call out, and I answered. A tree branch landed in the water. I grabbed it, and Emma pulled, and when I finally came out of the bog, I was shaking too hard to stand. Emma sank down beside me, and I fell into her arms. I killed it, I thought. I really killed it. All the time I'd spent being afraid, I never dreamed I could actually kill one. It made me feel powerful. Now,
I could defend myself. I knew I'd never be as strong as my grandfather, but I wasn't a gutless weakling either. I could kill them. I tested out the words. It's dead. I killed it. I laughed. Emma hugged me, pressing her cheek against mine. I know he would have been proud of you, she said. We kissed, and it was gentle and nice, rain dripping from our noses and running warm into our just open mouths. Too soon she broke away and whispered, What you said before, did you mean it? I'll stay, I said, if Miss Peregrine will let me. She will. I'll make certain of it. Before we worry about that, we'd better find my psychiatrist and take away his gun. Right, she said, her expression hardening. No time to waste then. We left the rain behind and emerged into a landscape of smoke and noise. The loop hadn't yet reset, and the bog was pocked with bomb holes, the sky buzzing with planes, walls of orange flame marching against the distant tree line. I was about to suggest we wait until today became yesterday and all this disappeared before trying to cross to the house when a set of brawny arms clapped around me. You're alive, Bronwyn cried. Enoch and Hugh were with her, and when she pulled away, they moved in to shake my hand and look me over. I'm sorry I called you a traitor, Enoch said. I'm glad you're not dead. Me too, I replied. All in one piece? Hugh asked, looking me over. 2 arms and 2 legs, I said, kicking out my limbs to demonstrate their wholeness. And you won't have to worry about that hollow anymore. We killed it. Oh, stuff the modesty, Emma said proudly. You killed it. That's brilliant, Hugh said, but neither he nor the other 2 could muster a smile. What's the matter? I asked. Wait, why aren't you 3 at the house? Where's Miss Peregrine? She's gone, said Bronwyn, her lip trembling. Miss Avocet, too. He took 'em. Oh, God, said Emma. We were too late. He come in with a gun, Hugh said, studying the dirt. Tried to take Claire hostage, but she chomped him with her back mouth, so he grabbed me instead. I tried to fight, but he knocked me upside the skull with his gun. He touched the back of his ear, and his fingers came away spotted with blood. Locked everyone in the basement, and said if Headmistress and Miss Avocet didn't change into birds, he'd put an extra hole in my head. So they did, and he stuffed them both into a cage. He had a cage? Emma said. Hugh nodded. Little one, too, so they didn't have room to do nothing, like change back or fly off. I reckoned I was good a shot, but then he pushed me down the basement with the others and run off with the birds. That's how we found him when we come in, Enoch said bitterly. Hiding down there like a lot of cowards. We wasn't hiding, Hugh cried. He locked us in. He would have shot us. Forget that, snapped Emma. Where'd he run off to? Why didn't you go after him? We don't know where he went, said Bronwyn. We was hoping you'd seen him. No, we haven't seen him, Emma said, kicking a cairn stone in frustration. Hugh drew something out of his shirt. It was a little photograph. He stuffed this in my pocket before he went. Said if we tried to come after him, this is what would happen. Bronwyn snatched the photo from Hugh. Oh, she gasped. Is that Miss Raven? I think it's Miss Crow, said Hugh, rubbing his face with his hands. That's it. They're good as dead, Enoch moaned. I knew this day would come. We should never have left the house, Emma said miserably. Millard was right. At the far edge of the bog, a bomb fell, its muted blast followed by a distant rain of excavated glop. Wait a minute, I said. First of all, we don't know that this is Miss Crow or Miss Raven. It could just as easily be a picture of a regular crow. And if Golem was going to kill Miss Peregrine and Miss Avocet, why would he go to all the trouble of kidnapping them? If he wanted them dead, they'd be dead already. I turned to Emma. And if we hadn't left, we'd be locked in the basement with everybody else. And there'd still be a hologhast wandering around. Don't try to make me feel better, she said. It's your fault this is happening. 10 minutes ago you said you were glad. 10 minutes ago Miss Peregrine wasn't kidnapped. Will you stop? Said Hugh. All that matters now is that the bird's gone and we gotta get her back. Fine, I said. So let's think. If you were a white, where would you take a couple of kidnapped Imbrins? Depends on what's to be done with them, Enoch said. And that we don't know. You'd have to get them off the island first, Emma said. So you need a boat. But which island? Asked Hugh. In the loop or out of it? The outside's getting torn apart by a storm, I said. Nobody's getting far in a boat over there. Then he's got to be on our side, Emma said, beginning to sound hopeful. So what are we larking about here for? Let's get to the docks. Maybe he's at the docks, Enoch said. That is, if he ain't gone yet. And even if he ain't, and we somehow managed to find him in all this dark, and without getting holes ripped through our guts by shrapnel on the way, there's still his gun to worry about. Have you all gone mad? Would you rather have the bird kidnapped or shot right in front of us? Fine then, Hugh shouted. Let's just give up and go home then, shall we? Who'd like a nice hot cup of tea before bed? Hell, as long as the bird ain't around, make it a toddy. He was crying, wiping angrily at his eyes. How can you not even try, after all she's done for us? Before Enoch could answer, we heard a voice calling us from the path. Hugh stepped forward, squinting, and after a moment, his face went strange. It's Fiona, he said. Before that moment, I'd never heard Fiona utter so much as a peep. It was impossible to make out what she was saying over the sound of planes and distant concussions, so we took off running across the bog. When we got to the path, we were breathing hard, and Fiona was hoarse from shouting, her eyes as wild as her hair. Immediately, she began to pull at us, to drag and push us down the path toward town, yelling so frantically in her thick Irish accent that none of us could understand. Hugh caught her by the shoulders and told her to slow down. She took a deep breath, shaking like a leaf, then pointed behind her. Millard followed him, she said. He was hiding when the man shut us all in the basement, and when he let out, Millard followed. Where to? I said. He had a boat. See? Cried Emma. The docks! No, said Fiona. It was your boat, Emma. The one you think nobody knows about that you keep stowed on that wee string of yours. He launched off with a cage and was just going in circles, but then the tide got too rough, so we pulled onto the lighthouse rock, and that's where he still is. We made for the lighthouse in a dead run. When we reached the cliffs overlooking it, we found the rest of the children in a thick patch of sawgrass near the edge. Get down, Millard hissed. We dropped to our knees and crawled over to them. They were crouched in a loose huddle behind the grass, taking turns peeking at the lighthouse. They looked shell-shocked, the younger ones especially, as if they hadn't fully grasped the unfolding nightmare. That we'd just survived a nightmare of our own barely registered. I crawled through the grass to the edge of the cliff and peered out. Past where the shipwreck lay submerged, I could see Emma's canoe tied to the rocks. Golan and the Imbrins were out of sight. What's he doing out there? I said. It's anyone's guess, Millard answered. Waiting for someone to pick him up, or for the tide to settle so he can row out. In my little boat? Emma said doubtfully. As I said, we don't know. 3 deafening cracks sounded in quick succession, and we all ducked as the sky flashed orange. Do any bombs fall around here, Millard? Asked Emma. My research concerns only the behavior of humans and animals, he replied. Not bombs. Fat lot of good that does us now, said Enoch. Do you have any more boats hidden around here? I asked Emma. I'm afraid not, she said. We'll just have to swim across. Swim across and what? Said Millard. Get shot to pieces? We'll figure something out, she replied. Millard sighed. Oh, lovely. Improvised suicide. Well? Emma looked at each of us. Does anyone have a better idea?
If I had my soldiers, Enoch began.
They'd fall to bits in the water, said Millard.
Enoch hung his head. The others went quiet.
Then it's decided, said Emma. Who's in?
I raised my hand. So did Bronwyn.
You'll need someone the White can't see, Millard said. Take me along if you must. 4's enough, Emma said. Hope you're all strong swimmers.
There was no time for second thoughts or long goodbyes. The others wished us luck, and we were on our way. We shed our black coats and loped through the grass, doubled over like commandos, until we came to the path that led to the beach. We slid down on our behinds, little avalanches of sand pouring around our feet and down our pants. Suddenly there was a noise like 50 chainsaws over our heads, and we ducked as a plane roared by, the wind whipping our hair and blowing up a sandstorm. I clenched my teeth, waiting for a bomb blast to tear us apart. None came. We kept moving. When we hit the beach, Emma gathered us in a tight huddle.
There's a shipwreck between here and the lighthouse, she said. Follow me out to it. Stay low in the water. Don't let him see you. When we reach the wreck, we'll look for our men and decide what's next. Let's get our Imbrans back, Bronwyn said.
We crawled down to the surf and slid into the cold water on our bellies. It was easy going at first, but the farther we swam from the shore, the more the current tried to push us back. Another plane buzzed overhead, kicking up a stinging spray of water. We were breathing hard by the time we reached the shipwreck. Clinging to its rusted hull, just our heads poking out of the water, we stared at the lighthouse and the barren little island that anchored it, but saw no sign of my wayward therapist. A full moon hovered low in the sky, breaking through reefs of bomb smoke, now and then to shine like the lighthouse's ghostly double. We pushed ourselves along the wreck until we reached the end, just a 50-yard swim in open water to the lighthouse rocks.
Here's what I reckon we should do, Emma said. He's seen how strong Wynn is, so she's in the most danger. Jacob and I find Golan and get his attention, while Wynn sneaks up from behind and gives him a belter over the head. Meantime, Millard makes a grab for the birdcage. Any objections?
As if in answer, a shot rang out. At first, we didn't realize what it was. It didn't sound like the gunshots we'd been hearing, distant and powerful. This was small caliber, a pop rather than a bang, and it wasn't until we heard a second one, accompanied by a nearby splash, that we knew it was Golan.
Fall back,
Emma shouted, and we stood out of the water and sprinted across the hull until it dropped out from beneath us, then dove into the open water beyond it. A moment later, we all came up in a cluster, panting for air.
So much for getting the drop on him,
Millard said. Golan had stopped shooting, but we could see him standing guard by the lighthouse door, gun in hand.
He may be an evil bastard, but he ain't stupid, Bronwyn said. He knew we'd come after him. Not now we can't, Emma said, slapping the water. He'll shoot us to bits.
Millard stepped up onto the wreck.
He can't shoot what he can't see. I'll go. You're not invisible in the ocean, dummy, Emma said.
And it was true. A torso-shaped negative space bobbed in the water where he stood.
More than you are, he replied. Anyhow, I followed him all the way across the island and he was none the wiser. I think I can manage a few 100 meters more.
It was difficult to argue since our only remaining options were either giving up or running into a hail of gunfire.
Fine, Emma said. If you really think you can make it.
Someone's got to be the hero, he replied, and walked off across the hull. Famous last words, I muttered. In the smoky distance, I saw Golan in the lighthouse doorway kneel down and take aim, leveling his arm across a railing. Look out, I shouted, but it was too late. A shot rang out. Millard groaned. We all clambered onto the wreck and raced towards him. I felt absolutely certain I was about to be shot, and for a moment I thought the splashes of our feet in the water were bullets raining down on us. But then the shooting stopped. Reloading, I thought, and we had a brief window of time. Millard was kneeling in the water, dazed, blood running down his torso. For the first time, I could see the true shape of his body, painted red. Emma took him by the arm.
"Millard, are you all right? Say something."
"I must apologize," he said. "It seems I've gone and gotten myself shot."
"We have to stop the bleeding," said Emma. "We've got to take him back to shore."
"Nonsense," Millard said. "That man will never let you get this close to him again. Turn back now, and we'll certainly lose Miss Peregrine." More shots rang out. I felt a bullet zip past my ear.
"This way," Emma shouted. "Dive."
I didn't know what she meant at first. We were 100 feet from the end of the wreck, but then I saw what she was running towards. It was the black hole in the hull, the door to the cargo hold. Bronwyn and I lifted Millard and ran after her. Metal slugs clanged into the hull around us. It sounded like someone kicking a trash can. "Hold your breath," I told Millard, and we came to the hold and dove in feet first. We pulled ourselves down the ladder a few rungs and hung there. I tried to keep my eyes open, but the salt water stung too much. I could taste Millard's blood in the water. Emma handed me the breathing tube, and we passed it among us. I was winded from running, and the single breath it allowed me every few seconds wasn't enough. My lungs hurt, and I began to feel lightheaded. Someone tugged at my shirt. "Come up." I pulled myself slowly up the ladder, and then Bronwyn, Emma, and I broke the surface just enough to breathe and talk, while Millard stayed safe a few feet below, the tube all to himself. We spoke in whispers and kept our eyes on the lighthouse.
"We can't stay here," Emma said. "Millard will bleed to death."
"It could take 20 minutes to get him back to the shore," I said. "He could just as easily die on the way."
"I don't know what else to do." "The lighthouse is close," Bronwyn said. "We'll take him there."
"Then Golan will make us all bleed to death," I said.
"No, he won't," replied Bronwyn.
"Why not? Are you bulletproof?"
"Maybe,"
Bronwyn replied mysteriously, then took a breath and disappeared down the ladder.
"What's she talking about?"
I said. Emma looked worried.
"I haven't a clue, but whatever it is, she'd better hurry."
I looked down to see what Bronwyn was doing, but instead caught a glimpse of Millard on the ladder below us, surrounded by curious flashlight fish. Then I felt the hull vibrate against my feet, and a moment later, Bronwyn surfaced holding a rectangular piece of metal about 6 feet by 4 with a riveted round hole in the top. She had wrenched the cargo hold's door from its hinges.
"And what are you going to do with that?" Emma said.
"Go to the lighthouse," she replied. Then she stood up and held the door in front of her.
"Win, he'll shoot you,"
Emma cried, and then a shot rang out and caromed right off the door.
"That's amazing," I said. "It's a shield."
Emma laughed.
"Win, you're a genius." "Millard can ride my back," she said. "The rest of you, fall in behind."
Emma brought Millard out of the water and hung his arms around Bronwyn's neck. "It's magnificent down there," he said. "Emma, why did you never tell me about the angels?"
"What angels?"
"The lovely green angels who live just below." He was shivering, his voice dreamy. "They kindly offered to take me to heaven."
"No one's going to heaven just yet,"
Emma said, looking worried.
"You just hang on to Bronwyn, all right?"
"Very well," he said vacantly. Emma stood behind Millard, pressing him into Bronwyn's back so he wouldn't slide off. I stood behind Emma, taking up the rear of our strange little Congo line, and we began to plod forward across the wreck toward the lighthouse. We were a big target, and right away Golan began to empty his gun at us. The sound of its bullets bouncing off the door was deafening, but somehow reassuring. But after about a dozen shots, he stopped. I wasn't optimistic enough to think he'd run out of bullets, though. Reaching the end of the wreck, Bronwyn guided us carefully into open water, always keeping the massive door held out in front of us. Our conga line became a chain of dog paddlers swimming in a knot behind her. Emma talked to Millard as we paddled, making him answer questions so we wouldn't drift into unconsciousness.
"Millard, who's the Prime Minister?"
"Winston Churchill," he said. "Have you gone daft?"
"What's the capital of Burma?"
"Lord, I've no idea." "Rangoon."
"Good. When's your birthday?"
"Will you quit shouting and let me bleed in peace?" It didn't take long to cross the short distance between the wreck and the lighthouse. As Bronwyn shouldered our shield and climbed onto the rocks, Golan fired a few more shots, and their impact threw her off balance. As we cowered behind her, she wobbled and nearly slipped backward off the rocks, which between her weight and the doors would have crushed us all. Emma planted her hands on the small of Bronwyn's back and pushed, and finally, both Bronwyn and the door tottered forward onto dry land. We scrambled after her in a pack, shivering in the crisp night air. 50 yards across at its widest, the lighthouse rocks were technically a tiny island, as the lighthouse's rusted base were a dozen stone steps leading to an open door, where Golan stood with his pistol aimed squarely in our direction. I risked a peek through the porthole. He held a small cage in one hand, and inside were 2 flapping birds, mashed so close together I could hardly tell one from the other. A shot whizzed past, and I ducked. "Come any closer and I'll shoot them both," Golan shouted, rattling the cage.
"He's lying," I said. "He needs them." "You don't know that," said Emma. "He's a madman after all."
"Well, we can't just do nothing."
"Rush him," Bronwyn said. "He won't know what to do. But if it's gonna work, we've gotta go now."
And before we had a chance to weigh in, Bronwyn was running toward the lighthouse. We had no choice but to follow. She was carrying our protection, after all. And a moment later, bullets were clanging against the door and chipping at the rocks around our feet. It was like hanging from the back of a speeding train. Bronwyn was terrifying. She bellowed like a barbarian, the veins in her neck bulging, with Millard's blood smeared all over her arms and back. I was very glad, in that moment, not to be on the other side of the door. As we neared the lighthouse, Bronwyn shouted, "Get behind the wall!" Emma and I grabbed Millard and cut left to take cover behind the far side of the lighthouse. As we ran, I saw Bronwyn lift the door above her head and hurl it towards Golan. There was a thunderous crash, quickly followed by a scream, and moments later Bronwyn joined us behind the wall, flushed and panting.
"I think I hit him,"
she said excitedly.
"What about the birds?" Emma said. "Did you even think about them?" "He dropped them, they're fine." "Well, you might have asked us before you went berserk and risked all our lives," Emma cried.
"Quiet," I hissed. We heard the faint sound of creaking metal.
"What is that?" "He's climbing the stairs," Emma replied.
"You'd better get after him," croaked Millard. We looked at him, surprised. He was slumped against the wall. "Not before we take care of you," I said. "Who knows how to make a tourniquet?" Bronwyn reached down and tore the leg of her pants.
"I do," she said. "I'll stop his bleeding. You get the white. I knocked him pretty good, but not good enough. Don't give him a chance to get his wind back."
I turned to Emma. "You up for this?"
"If it means I get to melt that white's face off,"
she said, little arcs of flame pulsing between her hands,
"then absolutely."
Emma and I clambered over the ship's door, which lay bent on the steps where it had landed, and entered the lighthouse. The building consisted mainly of one narrow and profoundly vertical room, a giant stairwell essentially, dominated by a skeletal staircase that corkscrewed from the floor to a stone landing more than 100 feet up. We could hear Golan's footsteps as he bounded up the stairs, but it was too dark to tell how far he was from the top. "Can you see him?" I said, peering up the stairwell's dizzying height. My answer was a gunshot ricocheting off a wall nearby, followed by another that slammed into the floor at my feet. I jumped back, heart hammering.
"Over here," Emma cried. She grabbed my arm and pulled me farther inside to the one place Golan's gunshots couldn't reach us, directly under the stairs. We climbed a few steps, which were already swaying like a boat in bad weather. "These are frightful," Emma exclaimed, her fingers white-knuckled as they gripped the rail. "Even if we make it to the top without falling, he'll only shoot us." "If we can't go up," I said, "maybe we can bring him down." I began to rock back and forth where I stood, yanking on the railing and stomping my feet, sending shockwaves up the stairs. Emma looked at me like I was nuts for a second, but then got the idea and began to stomp and sway along with me. Pretty soon the staircase was rocking like crazy. "What if the whole thing comes down?" Emma shouted. "Let's hope it doesn't." We shook harder. Screws and bolts began to rain down. The rail was lurching so violently I could hardly keep hold of it. I heard Golan scream a spectacular array of curses, and then something clattered down the stairs, landing nearby. The first thing I thought was, "Oh God, what if that was the birdcage?" And I dashed down the stairs past Emma and ran out on the floor to check. "What are you doing?" Emma shouted. "He'll shoot you." "No, he won't," I said, holding up Golan's handgun in triumph. It felt warm from all the firing he'd done and heavy in my hand, and I had no idea if it still had any bullets, or even how in the near darkness. To check. I tried in vain to remember something useful from the few shooting lessons Grandpa had been allowed to give me, but finally I just ran back up the steps to Emma. "He's trapped at the top," I said. "We've got to take it slow, try to reason with him, or who knows what he'll do to the birds." "I'll reason him right over the side," Emma replied through her teeth. We began to climb. The staircase swayed terribly and was so narrow that we could only proceed in single file, crouching so our heads wouldn't hit the steps above. I prayed that none of the fasteners we'd shaken loose had secured anything crucial. We slowed as we neared the top. I didn't dare look down. There were only my feet on the steps, my hand sliding along the shivering rail and my other hand holding the gun. Nothing else existed. I steeled myself for a surprise attack, but none came. The stairs ended in an opening in the stone landing above our heads, through which I could feel the snapping chill of night air and hear the whistle of wind. I stuck the gun through, followed by my head. I was tense and ready to fight, but I didn't see Golan. On one side of me spun the massive light, housed behind thick glass. This close it was blinding, forcing me to shut my eyes as it swung past, and on the other side was a spindly rail. Beyond that was a void, 10 stories of empty air, and then rocks and churning sea. I stepped onto the narrow walkway and turned to give Emma a hand up. We stood with our backs pressed against the lamp's warm housing and our fronts to the wind's chill. "The bird's close," Emma whispered. "I can feel her." She flicked her wrist and a ball of angry red flame sprang to life. Something about its color and intensity made it clear that this time she hadn't summoned a light, but a weapon. "We should split up," I said. "You go around one side and I'll take the other. That way he won't be able to sneak past us." "I'm scared, Jacob." "Me too, but he's hurt, and we have his gun." She nodded and touched my arm, then turned away. I circled the lamp slowly, clenching the maybe-loaded gun, and gradually the view around the other side began to peel back. I found Golan sitting on his haunches with his head down and his back against the railing, the birdcage between his knees. He was bleeding badly from a cut on the bridge of his nose, rivulets of red streaking his face like tears. Clipped to the bars of the cage was a small red light. Every few seconds, it blinked. I took another step forward, and he raised his head to look at me. His face was a stubble of caked blood, his one white eye shot through with red, spit flecking the corners of his mouth. He rose unsteadily, the cage in one hand. "Put it down." He bent over as if to comply, but faked away from me and tried to run. I shouted and gave chase, but as soon as he disappeared around the lamp housing, I saw the glow of Emma's fire flare across the concrete. Golan came howling back towards me, his hair smoking and one arm covering his face. "Stop!" I screamed at him, and he realized he was trapped. He raised the cage, shielding himself, and gave it a vicious shake. The birds screeched and nipped at his hand through the bars. "Is this what you want?" Golan shouted. "Go ahead. Burn me. The birds will burn too. Shoot me, and I'll throw them over the side." "Not if I shoot you in the head," he laughed. "You couldn't fire a gun if you wanted to. You forget. I'm intimately familiar with your poor, fragile psyche. It'd give you nightmares." I tried to imagine it, curling my finger around the trigger and squeezing, the recoil and the awful report. What was so hard about that? Why did my hand shake just thinking about it? How many whites had my grandfather killed? Dozens? Hundreds? If he were here instead of me, Golan would be dead already, laid out while he'd been squatting against the rail in a daze. It was an opportunity I'd already wasted, a split second of gutless indecision that might have cost the Imbrans their lives. The giant lamp spun past, blasting us with light, turning us into glowing white cutouts. Golan, who was facing it, grimaced and looked away. Another wasted opportunity, I thought. "Just put it down and come with us," I said. "Nobody else has to get hurt." "I don't know," Emma said. "If Miller doesn't make it, I might reconsider that." "You want to kill me?" Golan said. "Fine. Get it over with. But you'll only be delaying the inevitable, not to mention making things worse for yourselves. We know how to find you now. More like me are coming, and I can guarantee the collateral damage they do will make what I did to your friends seem downright charitable." "Get it over with?" Emma said, her flame sending a little pulse of sparks skyward. "Who said it would be quick?" "I told you. I'll kill them," he said, drawing the cage to his chest. She took a step towards him. "I'm 88 years old," she said. "Do I look like I need a pair of babysitters?" Her expression was steely, unreadable. "I can't tell you how long we've been dying to get out from under that woman's wing. I swear, you'd be doing us a favor." Golan swiveled his head back and forth, nervously sizing us up. Is she serious? For a moment, he seemed genuinely frightened, but then he said, "You're full of shit." Emma rubbed her palms together and pulled them slowly apart, drawing out a noose of flame. "Let's find out." I wasn't sure how far Emma would take this, but I had to step in before the birds went up in flames or were sent tumbling over the rail. "Tell us what you want with those Imbrans, and maybe she'll go easy on you," I said. "We only want to finish what we started," Golan said. "That's all we've ever wanted." "You mean the experiment?" Emma said. "You tried it once, and look what happened. You turned yourselves into monsters." "Yes," he said. "But what an unchallenging life it would be if we always got things right on the first go." He smiled. "This time, we'll be harnessing the talents of all the world's best time manipulators, like these two ladies here. We won't fail again. We've had 100 years to figure out what went wrong. Turns out, all we needed was a bigger reaction." "A bigger reaction?" I said. "Last time, you blew up half of Siberia." "If you must fail," he said grandly, "fail spectacularly." I remembered Horace's prophetic dream of ash clouds and scorched earth, and I realized what he'd been seeing. If the Whites and Hollows failed again, this time they'd destroy a lot more than 500 miles of empty forest, and if they succeeded, and turned themselves into the deathless demigods they'd always dreamed of becoming, I shuddered to imagine it. Living under them would be a hell all its own. The light came around and blinded Golan again. I tensed, ready to lunge, but the moment sped by too quickly. "It doesn't matter," Emma said. "Kidnap all the Embrins you want. They'll never help you." "Yes, they will. They'll do it, or we'll kill them one by one. And if that doesn't work, we'll kill you one by one and make them watch." "You're insane," I told him. The birds began to panic and screech. Golan shouted over them. "No! What's really insane is how you peculiars hide from the world when you could rule it, succumb to death when you could dominate it, and let the common genetic trash of the human race drive you underground when you could so easily make them your slaves, as they rightly should be." He drove home every sentence with another shake of the cage. "That's insane." "Stop it," Emma shouted. "So you do care." He shook the cage even harder. Suddenly, the little red light attached to its bars began to glow twice as bright, and Golan whipped his head around and searched the darkness behind him. Then he looked back at Emma and said, "You want them? Here." And he pulled back and swung the cage at her face. She cried out and ducked. Like a discus thrower, Golan continued the swing until the cage sailed over her head, then released. It flew out of his hands and over the rail, tumbling end over end into the night. I cursed, and Emma screamed and threw herself against the rail, clawing at the air as the cage fell toward the sea. In that moment of confusion, Golan leapt and knocked me to the ground. He slammed a fist into my stomach and another into my chin. I was dizzy and couldn't breathe. He grabbed for the gun, and it took every bit of my strength to keep him from snatching it. Because he wanted it so badly, I knew it must have been loaded. I would have thrown it over the rail, but he almost had it, and I couldn't let go. Emma was screaming, "Bastard! You bastard!" And then her hands, gloved in flame, came from behind and seized him around the neck. I heard Golan's flesh singe like a cold steak on a hot grill. He howled and rolled off me, his thin hair going up in flame. And then his hands were around Emma's throat, as though he didn't mind burning as long as he could choke the life out of her. I jumped to my feet, held the gun in both hands, and pointed it. I had, just for a moment, a clear shot. I tried to empty my mind and focus on steadying my arm, creating an imaginary line that extended from my shoulder through the sight to my target, a man's head. No, not a man, but a corruption of one. A thing, a force that arranged the murder of my grandfather and exploded all that I'd humbly called a life, poorly lived though it may have been, and carried me here, to this place, and this moment. In much the way less corrupt and violent forces had done my living and deciding for me since I was old enough to decide anything. Relax your hands, breathe in, hold it. But now I had a chance to force back, a slim nothing of a chance that I could already feel slipping away. Now squeeze. The pistol bucked in my hands, and its report sounded like the earth breaking open, so tremendous and sudden that I shut my eyes. When I opened them again, everything seemed strangely frozen. Though Golan stood behind Emma with her hands locked in a hold, wrestling her toward the railing, it was as if they'd been cast in bronze. Had the Embrins turned human again and worked their magic on us? But then everything came unstuck, and Emma wrenched her arms away, and Golan began to totter backward, and he stumbled and sat heavily on the rail. Gaping at me in surprise, he opened his mouth to speak, but found he could not. He clapped his hands over the penny-sized hole I'd made in his throat, blood lacing through his fingers and running down his arms, and then the strength went out of him, and he fell back, and he was gone. The moment Golan disappeared from view, he was forgotten. Emma pointed out to sea and shouted, "There! There!" Following her finger and squinting into the distance, I could barely pick out the pulse of a red LED bobbing on the waves.
Then we were scrambling to the hatch and sprinting down and down the endless seesawing staircase, hopeless that we could reach the cage before it sank, but hysterical to try anyway. We tore outside to find Millard wearing a tourniquet and Bronwyn by his side. He shouted something I didn't quite hear, but it was enough to assure me that he was alive. I grabbed Emma's shoulder and said, "The boat," pointing to where the stolen canoe had been lashed to a rock, but it was too far away, on the wrong side of the lighthouse, and there was no time. Emma pulled me instead toward the open sea, and, running, we dashed ourselves into it. I hardly felt the cold. All I could think about was reaching the cage before it disappeared beneath the waves. We tore at the water and sputtered and choked as black swells slapped our faces. It was difficult to tell how far away the beacon was, just a single point of light in a surging ocean of dark. It bobbed and fell and came and went, and twice we lost sight of it and had to stop, searching frantically before spotting it again. The strong current was carrying the cage out to sea, and us with it. If we didn't reach it soon, our muscles would fail and we'd drown. I kept this morbid thought to myself for as long as I could, but when the beacon disappeared a third time, and we looked for it for so long we couldn't even be sure what section of the rolling black sea it had disappeared from, I shouted, "We have to go back!" Emma wouldn't listen. She swam ahead of me, farther out to sea. I grasped at her scissoring feet, but she kicked me off. "It's gone! We aren't going to find them!" "Shut up! Shut up!" she cried, and I could tell from her labored breath that she was as exhausted as I was. "Just shut up and look!" I grabbed her and shouted in her face, and she kicked at me, and when I wouldn't let go, and she couldn't force me to, she began to cry, just wordless howls of despair. I tried to drag her back toward the lighthouse, but she was like a stone in the water, pulling me down. "You have to swim," I shouted. "Swim or we'll drown." And then I saw it, the faintest blink of red light. It was close, just below the surface. At first, I didn't say anything, afraid I'd imagined it, but then it blinked a second time. Emma whooped and shouted. It looked like the cage had landed on another wreck. How else could it have come to rest so shallowly? And because it had only just sunk, I told myself it was possible the birds were still alive. We swam and prepared to dive for the cage, though I didn't know where the breath would come from. We had so little left. Then, strangely, the cage seemed to rise toward us. "What's happening?" I shouted. "Is that a wreck?" "Can't be. There are none over here." "Then what the hell is that?" It looked like a whale about to surface, long and massive and gray, or some ghost ship rising from its grave. And there erupted a sudden and powerful swell that came up from below and pushed us away. We tried to paddle against it, but had no more luck than flotsam caught in a tidal wave, and then it thudded against our feet, and we were rising too, riding its back. It came out of the water beneath us, hissing and clanking like some giant mechanical monster. We were caught in a sudden rush of foaming surf that raced off it in every direction, thrown hard onto a surface of metal grates. We hooked our fingers through the grates to keep from being washed into the sea. I squinted through the salt spray and saw that the cage had come to rest between what looked like two fins jutting from a monster's back, one smaller and one larger. And then the lighthouse beam swept past, and in its gleam I realized they weren't fins at all, but a conning tower and a giant bolted-down gun. This thing we were riding wasn't a monster or a wreck or a whale. "It's a U-boat," I shouted. That it had risen right beneath our feet was no coincidence. It had to be what Golan was waiting for. Emma was already on her feet and sprinting across the rolling deck toward the cage. I scrambled to stand. As I began to run, a wave flashed over the deck and knocked us both down. I heard a shout and looked up to see a man in a gray uniform rise from a hatch in the conning tower and level a gun at us.
Bullets rained down, hammering the deck. The cage was too far away. We'd be torn to pieces before we could reach it. But I could see that Emma was about to try anyway. I ran and tackled her, and we tumbled sideways off the deck and into the water. The black sea closed above us. Bullets peppered the water, leaving trails of bubbles in their wake. When we surfaced again, she grabbed me and screamed, "Why did you do that? I nearly had them." "He was about to kill you," I said, rustling away, and then it occurred to me that she hadn't even seen him. She'd been so focused on the cage, so I pointed up at the deck where the gunner was striding towards it. He picked the cage up and rattled it. Its door hung open, and I thought I saw movement inside, some reason for hope. And then the lighthouse beam washed over everything. I saw the gunner's full face in the light, his mouth curled into a leering grin, his eyes depthless and blank. He was a white. He reached into the cage and pulled out a single sodden bird. From the conning tower, another soldier whistled to him, and he ran back toward the hatch with it. The sub began to rattle and hiss. The water around us churned as if boiling. "Swim, or it'll suck us down with it," I shouted to Emma, but she hadn't heard me. Her eyes were locked elsewhere, on a patch of dark water near the stern of the boat. She swam for it. I tried to stop her, but she fought me off. Then, over the whine of the sub, I heard it, a high, shrieking call. Miss Peregrine. We found her bobbing in the waves, struggling to keep her head above water, one wing flapping, the other broken-looking. Emma scooped her up. I screamed that we had to go. We swam away with what little strength we had. Behind us, a whirlpool was opening up, all the water displaced by the sub rushing back to fill the void as it sank. The sea was consuming itself and trying to consume us too, but we had with us now a screeching winged symbol of victory, or half a victory at least. And she gave us the strength to fight the unnatural current. Then we heard Bronwyn shouting our names, and our brawny friend came crashing through the waves to tow us back to safety. We lay on the rocks beneath the clearing sky, gasping for air and trembling with exhaustion. Millard and Bronwyn had so many questions, but we had no breath to answer them. They had seen Golan's body fall and the submarine rise and sink and Miss Peregrine come out of the water, but not Miss Avocet. They understood what they needed to. They hugged us until we stopped shaking, and Bronwyn tucked the headmistress under her shirt for warmth. Once we'd recovered a little, we retrieved Emma's canoe and pushed off towards the shore. When we got there, the children all waded into the shallows to meet us. "We heard shooting. What was that strange boat? Where's Miss Peregrine?" We climbed out of the rowboat, and Bronwyn raised her shirt to reveal the bird nuzzled there. The children crowded around, and Miss Peregrine lifted her beak and crowed at them to show that she was tired, but all right. A cheer went up. "You did it!" Hugh shouted. Olive danced a little jig and sang, "The bird, the bird, the bird. Emma and Jacob saved the bird." But the celebration was brief. Miss Avocet's absence was quickly noted, as was Millard's alarming condition. His tourniquet was tight, but he'd lost a lot of blood and was weakening. Enoch gave him his coat. Fiona offered her woolen hat. "We'll take you to see the doctor in town," Emma said to him. "Nonsense," Millard replied. "The man's never laid eyes on an invisible boy, and he wouldn't know what to do with one if he did. He'd either treat the wrong limb or run away screaming." "It doesn't matter if he runs away screaming," Emma said. "Once the loop resets, he won't remember a thing." "Look around you. The loop should have reset an hour ago." Millard was right. The skies were quiet. The battle had ended, but rolling drifts of bomb smoke still mixed with the clouds. "That's not good," Enoch said, and everyone got quiet. "In any case," Millard continued, "all the supplies I need are in the house. Just give me a bolt of laudanum and swab the wound with alcohol. It's only the fleshy part anyway. In 3 days I'll be right as rain." "But it's still bleeding," Bronwyn said.
pointing out red droplets that dotted the sand beneath him.
Then tie the damn tourniquet tighter.
She did, and Millard gasped in a way that made everyone cringe, then fainted into her arms.
Is he all right? Claire asked.
Just blacked out, is all, said Enoch. He ain't as fit as he pretends to be.
What do we do now? Ask Miss Peregrine, Olive said.
Right, put her down so she can change back, said Enoch. She can't very well tell us what to do while she's still a bird. So Bronwyn set her on a dry patch of sand, and we all stood back and waited. Miss Peregrine hopped a few times and flapped her good wing, and then swiveled her feathered head around and blinked at us. But that was it. She remained a bird.
Maybe she wants a little privacy, Emma suggested. Let's turn our backs.
So we did, forming a ring around her.
It's safe now, Miss P, said Olive. No one's looking.
After a minute, Hugh snuck a peek and said, Nope, still a bird.
Maybe she's too tired and cold, Claire said,
and enough of the others agreed this was plausible that it was decided we would go back to the house, treat Millard with what supplies we had, and hope that with some time to rest, both the headmistress and her loop would return to normal.